A September dusk settled gently over the village of Loudon, casting elongated shadows across the fields and crooked lanes. The air held a faint tang, a mixture of early autumn chill and sweet decay. At the far edge of the settlement stood a wooden sign, its lettering so worn and obscured by moss that few bothered to read it. A rusted chain blocked entry to the narrow road beyond, though it hardly seemed necessary. Except for the rare few who tested their bravado, most villagers avoided what lay past that barrier. A modest orchard bordered by a sagging wooden fence, all set against a backdrop of low-slung hills and towering gnarled oaks. The orchard's fruit shimmered with deceptive allure, gem-like apples and pears that beckoned, even from a distance. Yet, the locals knew better. They spoke in wary whispers about the orchard's caretaker and the orchard's terrible, ancient vow, a vow that claimed the souls of those foolhardy enough to eat of its harvest. The orchard had once been a pride of Loudon. Decades ago, residents would gather on crisp, sunny weekends to pick fruit directly from the trees. Children would chase one another, biting into juicy apples with laughter, and the orchard's caretaker, a craggy-faced figure known only as Old Bart, would stroll the rows, smiling. But that golden era ended on a chilling autumn day when a young woman named Adeline Carter was found sprawled among the roots of a tree, her hand still clutching half-eaten apples. No one could discern the cause of her death. The doctor who examined her looked pale and shaken, claiming he had never beheld such a vacant, haunted expression on a corpse. Rumors spread swiftly. Some said Adeline had choked, others insisted foul play, and still others whispered that Old Bart had done something to her, but no one knew for sure. As time passed, more unsettling events occurred. Animals that ventured into the orchard never returned, or, if they did, they were found slumped at the fence line, eyes bulging in terror. On moonlit nights, people living nearby claimed they saw forms moving among the trees, twisted shadows that seemed neither fully human nor wholly spectral. Veils of mist often gathered there at dusk, lingering until dawn. Seemingly unaffected, Old Bart continued to care for the trees, pruning them with unwavering devotion. Gossip spread that he was enthralled to the orchard, that he owed it a debt. Yet it was the orchard itself, not the caretaker, that held an unspoken power no one dared test. Over time, the property grew deserted. A few rebellious souls tested their nerve by sneaking onto the grounds for dares or youthful mischief, but the eerie hush that blanketed the orchard soon banished any sense of bravado. Slipping away, they never returned with fruit, nor did they speak of what they saw. Harriet Wilkinson had only recently arrived in Loudon. She sought refuge from a discontent she herself barely understood, leaving behind a chaotic city job and a broken engagement. The orchard caught her eye almost immediately. Walking past the chained-off road one late afternoon, she felt a prickle of intrigue, or perhaps some intangible pull that made her heart skip a beat. She asked one of her neighbors, a kindly middle-aged woman named Mrs. Dyer, about the orchard's history. Mrs. Dyer, typically so eager to chat, turned ashen. With trembling hands she set down her teacup and explained that the place was best left alone. "My father," she confessed, "warned me to never cross that fence. He used to say the ground there doesn't forgive trespassers, not if you take the orchard's fruit." Each night, Harriet lay awake, puzzling over Mrs. Dyer's cryptic warning. She found the orchard's forbidden mystery tantalizing. Fear and fascination waged a quiet war in her thoughts. On her third day in Loudon, she woke to an urgent need to see those twisted trees up close. She strolled the perimeter, sidestepping the sagging fence. Through the gnarled trunks, she glimpsed apples glistening a deep wine-red hue. Their skins seemed too lustrous, too perfect for any normal orchard. The hush was absolute. She could hear her own breathing rapid, shallow, while her eyes roamed the lines of trees. Then, to her mild shock, she saw a figure at the far edge of the orchard. An old man, hunched, with skin like aged parchment. He stood unmoving, a pruning knife dangling from his right hand. Harriet wasn't sure if he was staring at her or simply lost in thought. Startled, she took a step backward, expecting him to shout or chase her off. Instead, he slowly raised his free hand, as though in silent greeting. Her breath caught in her throat, and she managed a timid wave in return. Feeling almost magnetically pulled, Harriet slid through a gap in the fence. The moment she crossed onto orchard soil, a faint sense of dread unfurled in her stomach. The air felt heavier, moist, sweet, and oppressive. Still, she continued, feet crunching on fallen leaves, until she stood a few feet from the old man. She noticed the orchard floor was riddled with moldering apples. Some looked fresh and edible. Others rotted as though centuries had passed in a matter of weeks. It was told never to come here, Harriet managed, breaking the hush. The old man nodded, as if her statement were the most natural admission in the world. "They always say that," he replied, voice raspy. "Why?" Harriet asked, swallowing hard. "Because the orchard don't like to let people go." His words trailed off, and there was such a grim finality in them that Harriet found herself speechless. He turned back to his task, carefully slicing away small branches with the slow, deliberate precision of a surgeon. Harriet hovered, watching. The orchard seemed to ripple with quiet menace, as if it knew her presence, recognized it. The old man nodded at an upturned wooden crate under a tree, inviting her to sit. Though anxiety coiled in her gut, she incongruously felt more curiosity than fear. "This land was once well loved," he murmured, "and it gave much in return." At first, his gaze slid to Harriet, who lowered herself onto the crate. "But sometimes the land wants more than harvest. Sometimes it wants souls." She choked on a nervous laugh. "It's a bit dramatic." He shrugged. "Is it? If you can sense anything at all, you know the orchard isn't right." Harriet scanned the trees. Their thick bark split like old scars. Their leaves vibrated with a muted color, not quite green but not fully withered. Her eyes flitted to the fruit, which gleamed sickeningly. She wondered if it tasted as divine as it looked. Weeks passed. Harriet didn't mention her orchard visit to Mrs. Dyer, afraid the woman would scold her, or worse, greet her story with a frantic, pleading sort of dread. Yet, Harriet found herself drawn repeatedly to those fields. Something in the orchard's oppressive hush proved mesmerizing. She would stand at the fence, gaze across the orchard, and feel that gentle pull each time. She learned the old man's name was Bartimus Pierce, though villagers insisted on calling him Old Bart. If Harriet was to believe the rumors, Bart was older than he looked, having tended the orchard for more years than made any rational sense. She recalled hearing whispers that old Bart never aged in a natural way. Some speculated he had discovered a dark secret that tied him to those sinister apple trees. But Harriet, still clinging to her sense of reason, dismissed these stories as mere local folklore. On one cool afternoon, a gust whisked dying leaves into swirling shapes around Harriet as she stood just beyond the fence. The orchard's fruit dangled temptingly. She had begun to associate the orchard with a strange mix of dread and comfort, like recalling a half-forgotten lullaby from childhood. Lost in thought, she heard Bart's labored footsteps behind her. He came to stand at her side, silent for a moment. "You ever think about tasting one?" he asked quietly. Her heart thumped. "I'd be lying if I said it never crossed my mind." Bart nodded, expression blank. "You must resist. It's not for you. Not for anyone." She took a steadying breath. "But what happens if someone does?" Bart's stare grew distant. "The orchard won't let you leave. Not truly. It'll mark you, and one day it'll demand repayment." Despite the ominous tone of his warning, Harriet found her resolve weakening. Each day she battled a mounting urge to taste just one of those luscious apples. She told herself the orchard's fruit likely tasted normal, maybe a bit sweet, maybe a bit tart, but probably not more than that. The anxiety, the local legends, they were all working to magnify her curiosity. Whenever she asked Bart more about the orchard's past, he grew uncharacteristically silent, only repeating admonitions about how the orchard clung to that which it fed. Over time, Harriet heard faint echoes among the trees at dusk, a cry, a whisper, or laughter so distant she could not be sure it was real. Dreams soon haunted her nights, dreams in which she walked among twisted trunks burdened with so much fruit. In these dreams, she plucked an apple and sank her teeth into its flesh, only to wake with a bitter taste in her mouth. Matters grew worse on the evening of the harvest fair in Loudun. Villagers bustled through the lanes, celebrating the season. Stalls brimmed with crafts, preserves, and pies. Harriet roamed from one booth to the next, sampling roasted chestnuts, listening to local gossip. Late in the evening, beneath dim lantern glow, she overheard a hushed conversation between Mrs. Dyer and another older resident about two young men who had disappeared decades ago after sampling apples from the orchard. They were never found. Their footprints vanished at the orchard's border as though they had been swallowed by the earth itself. Harriet swiftly moved on, goosebumps crawling up her arms. She understood, more viscerally than ever, the orchard's grim reputation. But awareness did not diminish her temptation. As the fair wound down, Harriet strolled by the orchard road, a gentle breeze tugging at her shawl. She stared across the fence, bathed in moonlight. The trees seemed to bend ever so slightly, as though beckoning. With an unsteady hand, Harriet lifted the chain, just enough to slip beneath it. She didn't know why she did it. Perhaps it was the thrill of defiance, or maybe the orchard's subtle enchantment had finally gained the upper hand. Once inside, the moonlight illuminated gnarly branches that stretched like skeletal arms. The grass was damp beneath her shoes, exuding the sweet, rotting smell of fallen fruit. She reached up to a low-hanging branch, paused, then plucked a single apple. Its skin felt impossibly smooth. Its fragrance was decadent, dizzying. Harriet hesitated, recalling Bart's warning, and yet this was the moment she realized she had to know. She lifted the fruit to her mouth. When her teeth broke the skin, a gush of frighteningly rich, almost metallic juice spilled onto her tongue. It tasted beyond anything she could have imagined, both delectable and revolting, akin to sweet honey forged from rotted flowers. A sudden, all-consuming rush of cold coursed through her veins, as though the orchard were pumping ice into her bloodstream. She staggered, and nearly dropped the apple as her vision blurred. For a brief, horrific instant, she glimpsed unrecognizable shapes drifting through the orchard, a huddled figure clutching half-eaten fruit, a child's eyes wide with terror, an elderly woman sobbing at the base of a tree. She blinked, and the ghosts vanished, replaced by stillness. A faint throbbing in her skull persisted, though, along with a sensation of something dreadful awakening in her. She spat out the bite, letting it land on the soil. Trembling, she dropped the rest of the fruit. In that moment, Harriet understood the orchard had claimed her in some way. She limped away, stumbling past the fence and onto the moonlit road, heart pounding. She told no one of her transgression for fear the orchard's power would grow if she spoke of it, but each morning after, she woke with a headache that wouldn't quite vanish. Her appetite faded, replaced by a dull, inescapable craving. By the following week, she could no longer sleep through the night. Nightmares took hold, featuring the orchard as an endless labyrinth in which she wandered, searching for something she could never name, and at the edge of sleep, she always heard a soft chant, urging her back. Days blurred into each other, and Harriet felt her life shifting from mere curiosity to feverish obsession. She wandered Loudun's crooked lanes like a lost soul, hollow-eyed, passing by shops and neighbors in a daze. The orchard's call echoed through her mind, a siren's lullaby. She secluded herself in her small cottage and tried to read or sew, but her concentration was shattered. Her nights grew worse. She frequently jolted awake, a metallic taste still clinging to her tongue. She thought she heard skittering movements outside her window, but when she peered into the darkness, nothing was there. Then, late one evening, Bart arrived at her door. Tired and drawn, Harriet let him in. His eyes roamed the cramped sitting room, falling at last on her pallid face. Without question, he saw the orchard's mark. "You ate from it," he said solemnly. It wasn't a question. Harriet nodded, tears welling. "You'll have to face it now," Bart said. "The orchard doesn't release its hold once it's got a taste of you." She stared at him, fear paralyzing her. "But maybe," he added with a grim tone, "there's a chance to break the cycle." "How?" she managed, hope twisting painfully in her chest. He lowered his head. "I've tried. God help me, I've tried for years. But the orchard is older than all of us. I know certain rites, though. An all-night vigil. A cleansing that has to be done at the orchard's heart. If it fails, Harriet, then your soul is forfeit." With that stark warning, Harriet pressed him for details. He explained that the orchard served as a conduit, channeling a dark energy that demanded tribute in an endless cycle. Once a person ate its fruit, they were essentially bound to that land. Over time, it would drain them, feeding on their final breath. Sometimes the orchard's victims disappeared, sinking into the soil as if never existing in the first place. Bart had once loved a young woman who fell prey to the orchard, and in his guilt, he vowed to remain as caretaker, hoping that by tending it, he might eventually find a way to set her soul and others free. The plan was simple, if horrifying. Harriet would stand vigil in the orchard from dusk until dawn, never succumbing to the orchard's beckoning attempts. The orchard would test her with illusions, voices, perhaps the phantom shapes of lost souls. But Harriet was to stay put, ignoring every temptation, every terror. By sunrise, if a resolve held, the orchard's curse would weaken, and she could walk away whole. If she faltered, the orchard would consume her spirit forever. On the appointed night, Harriet followed Bart beyond the rusted chain. In her hand was a small lantern, though its glow seemed pitiful against the stifling darkness of the orchard. The sky was overcast, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Bart guided her through winding rows of trees until they reached a colossal oak at the orchard's center. Here, the grass felt damp and spongy. The oak's roots jutted from the ground like the bones of ancient giants, and the hush felt menacing, so profoundly still that Harriet's heart pounded in her ears. Bart pressed a small iron charm into her palm, telling her it might guard her from the orchard's darkest illusion. "I'll be nearby," he said, "but you must stand your ground, alone. Don't move from this spot until sunrise." Harriet nodded, gripping the charm with trembling fingers. Bart trudged away and vanished amid the gloom. She stood under the oak as the clouds above shifted sluggishly, revealing fleeting glimpses of moonlight. The orchard seemed to inhale around her, the wind rattling branches in an almost living cadence. Time stretched. Harriet's muscles grew sore from standing so rigidly. The orchard's hush morphed into subtle rustlings, fallen apples rolling across the ground without visible cause, twigs snapping in the darkness. She heard whispers drifting on the breeze, faint at first, but gradually intensifying, as though circling her. Occasionally a figure would pass between the trees, sometimes shapeless, other times resembling someone from her memories, her mother, her ex-fiancé, or friends from childhood. Each apparition beckoned, murmuring soothing words, or else stared at her with wide, hollow eyes. Harriet's breath came in gasps, but she recalled Bart's warning and the orchard's appetite for fear. She must not yield. At the stroke of midnight, a sudden wave of dizziness crashed over her. She dropped to one knee, pressing her hand against the ground to steady herself. The earth felt warm, pulsing with a heartbeat of its own. She forced herself upright, every muscle trembling, and resumed her vigil. An hour later, she glimpsed Adeline Carter, the orchard's first known victim, drifting among the apple trees. The young woman's eyes glowed with a faint, sorrowful luminescence. Her mouth parted, as though trying to speak, but no words emerged. Instead, a thin, strained moan escaped her lips. The sight tore at Harriet's resolve. She wanted to comfort this lost soul or turn and run as fast as she could, but she did neither. She stood firmly, fists clenched until her nails bit into her palms. Adeline vanished, leaving Harriet's nerves frayed. As the night crawled on, Harriet perceived Bart's distant silhouette moving through the orchard's perimeter. He didn't approach, but she felt his presence as a thin thread of hope. The orchard battered her senses with new illusions. She saw rotten fruit rolling towards her, fouled lumps bursting with maggots. And once, the orchard's entire layout seemed to shift, as though the trees had rearranged themselves into a labyrinth. With each new horror, Harriet clung to the small iron charm. Behind the illusions, she sensed a primal rage from the orchard, an angry consciousness that recognized her determination. It wanted her to fail, to kneel and eat the cursed fruit, or to flee in terror so it could claim her soul. She pressed on, reciting half-remembered prayers, poems, anything to anchor her mind. Each time the orchard conjured images from her past, her heartbreak, her regrets. She bit her lip, focusing instead on what she stood to lose if she yielded. Finally, the sky began to lighten. The gloom receded, with faint shafts of gray illuminating the orchard floor. Like a prowling beast retreating, the orchard's illusions slowly faded. A final gust hissed through the branches, carrying the orchard's despairing howl. Harriet felt the tension in her chest loosen as the first pale rays of dawn broke. Bart reappeared, stepping cautiously among the trees, and Harriet felt tears of relief welling in her eyes. The orchard, for the moment, seemed subdued, its malevolent aura diminished by the sunlight. "It's done," Bart said quietly, placing a trembling hand on her shoulder. "You broke free." Harriet clutched at him, her tears spilling, uncertain if she should laugh or collapse in exhaustion. The orchard might remain cursed, but she at least had slipped from its grasp. Bart led her back to the fence. The morning sun offered a reassuring warmth, and Harriet drew deep, freeing breaths. She glanced over her shoulder at the orchard. It looked no less malevolent, but it was silent now, the fruit glimmering in the fresh light. She felt an overwhelming urge to run until the orchard was just a distant memory. And yet, some part of her, the part that knew only fragments of Bart's long struggle, ached for the soul still trapped. She lowered her head, whispering a quiet apology to those lost to the orchard's ravenous power. They were beyond her help. All she could do was escape. Bart moved to latch the rusted chain across the entry. As he did, he studied Harriet one last time, his eyes a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow. "Go now," he murmured, "and don't come back. Some curses are best left sealed." Harriet acquiesced, stepping away from the orchard. She glanced behind her only once, catching Bart's stooped figure receding into the orchard. She couldn't bring herself to call out, to ask why he still stayed. Perhaps he was doomed, or determined, she wasn't sure which. But in that final glance, the twisted rows of trees looked menacing as ever, their ample fruit gleaming an unholy invitation. Harriet spent the following autumn weeks packing her belongings and finalizing her departure. No one in the village inquired about her weight loss or the haunted look around her eyes. They suspected the truth, or at least guessed that she had ventured where no one should. Mrs. Dyer gave her a farewell bouquet of dried lavender and wished her safe travels. Harriet forced a polite smile, too weary to explain her deeper reasons for leaving. In the dark hours of her last night in Loudun, she dreamed of the orchard again, the same twisted branches and the illusions that battered her senses. But this time, in the dream, she turned away. She ran until morning's light broke the haze. When she left the next day, the sky was a brilliant blue. She drove her battered car along winding country roads, refusing even a sideways glance at the orchard's chain-front entrance. She let that chapter close. Over the horizon, farmland and rolling hills shifted into the distance. She didn't look back, nor did she slow her speed, and somewhere behind her the orchard remained, waiting for its next unwitting visitor. It would stand as it always had, strong and silent. The fruit would continue to ripen in the hush, shining like polished rubies in the sunlight. Day after day, season after season, it would stand, patient and hungry, a centuries-old snare for anyone who might dismiss the warnings and taste of its forbidden harvest. And, as Harriet left Loudun for good, she prayed for whoever might come next, and for the orchard's restless, thrumming heart doomed to harvest far more than apples in the shadows.